In the scorching August heat of 1192, 700 exhausted crusaders stood ankle-deep in Mediterranean surf, facing 7,000 of Saladin's finest warriors. What happened next wasn't just impossible. It was so unbelievable that even the enemy chroniclers couldn't deny it happened. 700 men, no horses, the king still wearing deck shoes, against 7,000 battle-hardened warriors who had just conquered an entire city. The last Crusader stronghold on the coast was falling. If Jaffa fell, the entire Third Crusade would collapse, and Christian presence in the Holy Land would end forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one king's insane gamble not only saved a city, but created a military legend so powerful that it shaped warfare for centuries. You'll discover why Saladin's own commanders begged him to retreat from a force they outnumbered 10-1. You'll learn the tactical secret that turned swimming soldiers into an unstoppable force. And you'll see how prisoners with no weapons became the key to victory. How could men in deck shoes defeat mounted cavalry? How could a surprise attack work in broad daylight? What was the secret message that changed Richard's entire strategy mid-voyage? These aren't just questions. They're the keys to understanding one of history's most shocking military victories. To understand how this impossible victory happened, let me take you back 3 days earlier. The Third Crusade had reached a stalemate. For 3 years, Christian and Muslim armies had bled each other dry across the Holy Land. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187, shocking Christian Europe. Now, in 1192, the Crusaders clung to a narrow strip of coast, while Muslims controlled the interior. Two titans dominated this conflict. Richard I of England, the Lionheart, was medieval Europe's greatest warrior king. At 6 feet 5 inches, he towered over other men, leading from the front in every battle. He'd never lost a major engagement. His mere presence on a battlefield could turn defeat into victory. But Richard was desperate. He'd been away from England for 2 years. His kingdom needed him. His treasury was empty. Facing him stood Saladin, the merciful conqueror, who had united the Muslim world and recaptured Jerusalem. Unlike the brutal warlords of his era, Saladin was known for chivalry and strategic patience. He'd learned that time was his greatest weapon. Let the Crusaders exhaust themselves, let their supplies dwindle. Let disease thin their ranks, then strike. By July 1192, both leaders were negotiating peace. Richard controlled the coast from Tyre to Ascalon. Saladin held Jerusalem and the interior. Neither could achieve total victory. Richard prepared his fleet to sail home, planning to leave the Crusader kingdom in capable hands. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Saladin had been watching, waiting for one specific moment. His spies reported Richard's departure preparations. The Lionheart would leave a skeleton garrison at Jaffa, maybe 2,000 men. The city's walls were strong, but its defenders would be demoralized, knowing their legendary leader had abandoned them. What happened next shocked even Richard's own men. On July 26, Saladin struck, not with a raid or siege, but with overwhelming force. This wasn't about territory, it was about shattering Crusader morale forever. Take their last great port while their king sailed away, prove that without Richard the Crusaders were nothing. The chess game between two of history's greatest commanders was about to become a race against time, and Richard didn't even know the game had started. Saladin's army materialized before Jaffa like a desert storm. The Muslim chroniclers, Sweshteen, always careful with numbers, counted 5,000 cavalry. Not just riders, but Mamluks and Ghulams, professional soldiers who'd trained since childhood. Their Damascus steel could slice through Crusader mail. Their composite bows could punch through shields at 250 yards. Supporting them came 2,000 infantry, veterans of Jerusalem, Hattin, and a dozen other victories. Behind them rolled the siege engines, mangonels that could hurl 200-pound stones, trebuchets that had cracked the walls of seemingly impregnable fortresses. This wasn't a raiding force. This was an army of conquest. Inside Jaffa, the situation was desperate. The garrison numbered 2,000, mostly infantry, with perhaps 50 knights. Good soldiers, but they'd been expecting to go home. Their leader, Henri of Champagne, was competent but no Richard. They had supplies for a siege, strong walls, and the knowledge that help wasn't coming. Richard was already at Acre, his ships loaded, ready to sail for England. Then Saladin made a decision that historians still can't explain. Instead of a methodical siege, he ordered an immediate assault. Perhaps he feared Richard might return, perhaps he wanted to crush the garrison before they could properly organize. On July 27th, waves of Muslim warriors crashed against Jaffa's walls. The defenders fought desperately, but they were outnumbered 3-1. For 3 days, the battle raged. Saladin's engineers undermined the walls while his archers swept the battlements. On July 29th, a section of wall collapsed. Muslim warriors poured through the breach. Street by street, house by house, Jaffa fell. The garrison retreated to the citadel, the last stronghold perched above the harbour. But the real game-changer wasn't the knights. It was something nobody expected. As the citadel's last defenders prepared for death, a priest named Hugh made a desperate decision. Below, in the harbour, he could see Saladin's banners already flying over the city. In hours, maybe less, the citadel would fall. Someone had to reach Richard. Someone had to try. Hugh stripped to his underclothes, said a prayer, and dove from the citadel walls into the Mediterranean. The 40-foot drop could have killed him. Muslim archers on the walls fired at the splash, but Hugh swam into open water, praying that God, or Richard's fleet, would find him. Meanwhile, Richard sat aboard his flagship 24 miles north at Acre. His holds were packed with treasure and supplies for the voyage home. In 2 days, favourable winds would carry him to Cyprus, then Europe. The King of England was literally hours from abandoning the Holy Land forever. Here's the detail that changed everything. Just as Richard prepared to weigh anchor, a lookout spotted something in the water. A lone swimmer, exhausted, waving desperately. They pulled Hugh aboard, nearly dead from exhaustion. But the priest's message electrified Richard. Jaffa holds but barely. The citadel still flies your banner, but not for long. Richard faced an impossible choice. His ships were loaded for a sea voyage, not battle. He had only his household knights, 54 men, plus 400 Italian crossbowmen and 250 sailors, less than 800 men total, against Saladin's thousands. Richard's decision came in seconds. Turn the fleet south. The king who'd spent 2 years trying to leave suddenly burned to return. But this wasn't the massive Crusader army that had conquered Acre. This was a departure fleet converted to a desperate rescue mission. As his ships turned south, Richard transformed from king to general. He ordered armour unpacked, weapons distributed to sailors, crossbow bolts counted. Every man who could hold a weapon would fight. The Italian crossbowmen checked their strings. Their guild's weapons could outrange Muslim bows by 100 yards, but they'd need every advantage. What the Muslim chroniclers wrote next is almost unbelievable. July 31st, dawn. Richard's fleet, 15 ships, approached Jaffa. From the sea, they could see Saladin's green banners on the walls. The harbour was full of Muslim vessels. Any rational commander would have seen the futility and turned back. Richard saw opportunity. He ordered his red-painted flagship forward, alone. The king stood at the prow in partial armour, mail shirt, but no leg protection, just deck shoes. His advisers begged him to don full armour. Richard's response revealed his tactical genius. Speed is our armour today. We hit the beach running or we die in the surf. But Richard had one advantage Saladin never saw coming. The Muslim army, drunk on victory, was looting the lower city. Discipline, the hallmark of Saladin's forces, had momentarily lapsed. Their sentries watched the sea, but who feared 15 ships against 7,000 men? The red galley approached the beach, then another ship, then another. To the sentries it looked like a negotiation party, perhaps seeking terms for the citadel's surrender. The next 30 seconds would determine the fate of the Crusades. At 200 yards from shore, Richard gave the order. The crossbowmen fired a single, coordinated volley. 400 bolts darkened the sky, catching the beach sentries completely unprepared. Before the Muslims could react, Richard vaulted the ship's rail into waist-deep water. "St. George! St. George!" The Lionheart's battle cry echoed across the water. Behind him, 54 knights plunged into the Mediterranean, the weight of their armor threatening to drag them under. They had to reach the beach before they drowned, or Muslim arrows found them. Then came the moment that turned defeat into legend. The 400 Italian crossbowmen waded ashore in practiced formation, firing as they advanced. Their bolts outranged Muslim arrows, creating a deadly corridor of covering fire. Behind them, 250 sailors hit the beach with boat hooks, axes, anything that could serve as a weapon. In medieval warfare, contested beach landings were considered impossible. The defenders' advantage was too great, but Richard had calculated perfectly. But wait, the prisoners were about to change everything. Inside Jaffa, hundreds of captured garrison soldiers heard something impossible: Richard's voice, Richard's battle cry, coming from the sea. In the citadel above, the exhausted defenders saw the red banner approaching the beach. Hope, that most powerful weapon, surged through Christian ranks. What Richard did next broke every rule of medieval combat. Instead of forming defensive lines on the beach, Richard charged. On foot, in deck shoes, through sand that grabbed at every step. His golden banner streamed behind him as 700 men followed their king straight into a city held by 7,000 enemies. Military tacticians call this suicide. Richard called it psychology. Saladin's commanders saw something that made their blood run cold. From their positions, the beach looked covered with ships, men, banners, the coordinated volleys, the discipline of the landing. Surely this was the vanguard of a massive army. No one would attack with just 700 men, would they? The first Muslim soldiers to face Richard's charge were looters, their arms full of plunder. They dropped everything and ran, screaming warnings. The English king, the Lionheart returns. Panic is contagious. In narrow streets, fleeing soldiers crashed into advancing reinforcements. Commanders couldn't see the beach, could only hear the growing clamor of combat and retreat. The statistics here are staggering. In the first 10 minutes, Richard's force covered 400 yards of contested ground. They'd broken through the outer defense line and reached the city gates, the same gates that had taken Saladin 3 days to breach. The crossbowmen kept up continuous fire, their shorter range now an advantage in the cramped streets. Richard hit the beach at full sprint, water streaming from his mail. Behind him, knights struggled through the surf, their 60-pound armor now carrying 25 pounds of seawater. One knight stumbled and went under. His companions dragged him upright, gasping. But the beach itself was about to become a weapon. The sand, churned by thousands of Muslim horses over 3 days, was soft and treacherous. But Richard's sailors were used to uncertain footing on wet decks. The pursuing Muslim cavalry, confident in their mobility, suddenly found their horses sinking to the fetlocks. The crossbowmen turned this to advantage, targeting riders as their mounts struggled. Then Richard did something that even his enemies called miraculous. Instead of consolidating on the beach, he pressed inland immediately. The king personally led the charge up the beach road, his sword already bloodied. A Muslim officer tried to organize resistance. Richard cut him down without breaking stride. The sight of their commander falling sent nearby troops into flight. The next detail sounds like fiction, but 3 sources confirm it. As Richard crested the beach rise, he could see into Jaffa's streets. Saladin's soldiers were everywhere, but in complete disorder. Some were looting, others trying to form ranks, most simply milling in confusion. Richard raised his sword and roared a single word: "Now!" The 400 crossbowmen fired their second coordinated volley directly into the packed streets. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who'd been celebrating victory suddenly faced death from an unexpected direction. The rout began before the real fighting even started. Richard plunged into Jaffa's streets like a thunderbolt. The narrow lanes that should have favored defenders became death traps for fleeing soldiers. The king fought with controlled fury, every sword stroke calculated to clear the path forward. What followed was less a battle and more a force of nature. Behind Richard, his 54 knights formed a steel wedge. These weren't fresh warriors. They were exhausted men who'd just wrestled through surf in full armor. But they were also Richard's household guard, the elite of Crusader chivalry. In the confined streets, their heavy armor and long swords gave them crushing advantage over lightly equipped looters. But Saladin's greatest mistake was still coming. Muslim commanders tried to rally their men at the main square. A squadron of Mamluks, Saladin's best cavalry, charged down the main street to stem the Crusader advance. In open ground, they would have shattered Richard's tired infantry. But the streets were clogged with their own fleeing soldiers. The aftermath reveals the true genius of Richard's gamble. The Mamluk charge disintegrated into chaos. Horses reared and screamed, unable to maneuver. Crusader crossbowmen, firing from doorways and side streets, picked off riders methodically. Richard himself waded into the melee, his height and reach allowing him to strike down mounted opponents. In minutes, Saladin's finest unit was reduced to scattered survivors fleeing for their lives. Here's the twist that changes how we see this entire battle. The Muslim army wasn't defeated, it was dissolving. Soldiers who'd never actually seen Richard's force assumed thousands of Crusaders were pouring into the city. The panicked cries of the full English army spread faster than the actual fighting. Units that could have easily overwhelmed Richard's 700 men instead fought each other to escape through the gates. The speed of collapse defied military logic. Richard had been fighting for less than 30 minutes, yet Muslim resistance was evaporating across the entire city. The key was perception and the prisoners. But then something extraordinary happened. From cellars and locked buildings across Jaffa, captured Crusader soldiers heard Richard's battle cry. Using improvised tools, chair legs, even their chains, they broke free. A Muslim chronicler recorded, "The Franks we had captured became lions, falling upon our men with their bare hands." These weren't organized breakouts, but hundreds of individual acts of desperation. A prisoner strangled his guard with the very chains that bound him. Others set fires, adding smoke and confusion to the chaos. Most importantly, they swelled Richard's numbers, at least in perception. Every escaped prisoner who grabbed a Muslim weapon became another proof that a massive Crusader army had arrived. Then Saladin made a decision that historians still can't explain. From his command position on a hill overlooking Jaffa, Saladin could see the entire battle. His staff urged him to commit his reserves, 3,000 fresh troops who could have crushed Richard's exhausted force. Instead, the Sultan watched in silence as his army disintegrated. Some historians believe he recognized the battle was lost psychologically. Others suggest he was unwilling to risk his veterans against what he believed was a larger force. The real answer might be simpler and more profound. Saladin, master strategist, understood when momentum becomes unstoppable. Richard had created a psychological avalanche. Sending more men into those narrow streets would only add to the catastrophe. By the second hour, the battle had become a one-sided pursuit. Richard's force, impossibly, was driving an army 10 times its size from a fortified city. The mathematics defied belief, but mathematics don't account for panic. The statistics reveal the true scale of the rout. Muslim cavalry trampled their own infantry trying to escape through the gates. Valuable siege equipment was abandoned. Soldiers threw away weapons and armor to run faster. The same veterans who had conquered Jaffa 3 days earlier now fled from exhausted sailors carrying boat hooks. Richard pressed his advantage ruthlessly. Reaching the main gate, he found it clogged with fleeing soldiers. The king and his knights carved through them like a scythe through wheat. Behind them, the Italian crossbowmen maintained their deadly accuracy, turning the gate area into a killing ground. But the most decisive moment was still coming. A group of Muslim commanders tried one last stand at the eastern gate. If they could hold long enough for their army to escape, then regroup outside the walls. Richard saw the danger immediately. Taking a squad of his best knights, he personally led a flanking charge through side streets. The king burst into the rear of the Muslim position just as they thought they'd stabilized the situation. The sight of Richard, blood-soaked, roaring his battle cry, shattered their resolve. The last organized resistance collapsed. The Eastern Gate became another scene of panicked flight as Saladin's army streamed into the countryside, pursued by Crusader crossbow bolts. High on his hilltop command post, Saladin watched his magnificent army dissolve. Staff officers begged him to intervene. His personal guard of 1,000 Mamluks sat ready, hands on sword hilts, awaiting orders that never came. Let that sink in for a moment. The greatest Muslim commander since the Prophet's companions, watching 700 Christians rout 7,000 of his best troops. Yet Saladin made no move to his sword. When pressed by his generals, he reportedly said, "Allah has willed this Christian madness to succeed. Who are we to contest his design?" But military historians suggest a more practical reason. Saladin had spent decades building his reputation and army. One hallmark of great commanders is knowing when not to fight. Richard had created conditions where Muslim defeat was certain, not through numbers or tactics, but through psychological dominance. Committing reserves would only add to the casualty list. Remember that number, 700. As the rout reached its climax, Saladin ordered general withdrawal. His banners, visible throughout the battle as rallying points, suddenly retreated eastward. The psychological impact was immediate and final. Any soldier still fighting saw their sultan abandoning the field. The trickle of retreat became a flood. By the third hour, the impossible had occurred. Richard's 700 controlled Jaffa. Saladin's 7,000 were scattered across miles of countryside. The beach where Crusaders had waded ashore was now littered with abandoned Muslim equipment. The city that had taken Saladin 3 days to capture had been lost in 3 hours. In less than 1 hour, the impossible had happened. The moment Saladin's banner retreated from the hillside, Jaffa's fate was sealed. Muslim soldiers still in the city, perhaps 500 trapped by the speed of Richard's advance, threw down weapons and begged for quarter. Richard, exhausted but merciful, accepted their surrender. The same knights who'd been cutting down fleeing enemies now became protectors of prisoners. This is why it matters to us today. The citadel defenders, watching from above, couldn't believe their eyes. 3 hours earlier, they'd been negotiating surrender terms. Now they saw Richard's banner flying over the city gates. The garrison commander later wrote, "We thought it was a dream or divine vision. Only when we heard the king's voice calling up to us did we believe." The casualty figures defy conventional military wisdom. Richard's force lost 2 knights drowned in the landing, 5 sailors killed in street fighting. Total, 7 dead. Saladin's army suffered over 700 killed, mostly in the panicked flight through the gates. Hundreds more were captured. The mathematical impossibility, 100-to-1 casualty ratio, stands as one of history's most lopsided victories. What Richard did next revealed his humanity. The king collapsed on the beach, still in his salt-crusted armor. For 6 hours he'd fought without pause, from ship to surf to street combat. His household knights formed a protective circle as Richard slept where he'd fallen, sword still in hand. Not even victory could overcome total exhaustion. But Saladin wasn't finished. That night, as Richard slept, Muslim scouts crept close to Jaffa. They reported the truth. Not thousands of crusaders, but fewer than 700 exhausted men. The Sultan's shame turned to rage. He'd been defeated by a trick, by psychology rather than strength. Here's what you need to understand about what happened next. Dawn, August 1st. Richard woke to horns and drums. Saladin had returned with his reorganized army, but the psychological damage was irreversible. The Muslim soldiers who'd fled in panic now approached hesitantly. They'd seen Richard turn impossible odds into victory. What tricks did he have now? Richard, despite exhaustion, read the situation perfectly. He arranged his tiny force in defensive positions, crossbowmen on the walls, knights ready to countercharge. Most importantly, he stood visible on the ramparts, armor gleaming, banner flying. The message was clear. The Lionheart was ready for round 2. The next 3 minutes would determine everything. Saladin's army approached to just outside crossbow range and stopped. For an hour, 7,000 soldiers stared at 700. Neither side moved. Then, incredibly, Saladin ordered withdrawal. Again, his commander's protests were ignored. The Sultan had seen enough. Whatever demon possessed Richard at Jaffa, Saladin wanted no more part of it. Later, Saladin would send Richard a gift, 2 horses, acknowledging that a king shouldn't fight on foot. The chivalry between enemies masked a deeper truth. Saladin knew the war was over. If 700 crusaders could take Jaffa, what would happen when Richard returned with a real army? But the war's end came from exhaustion, not victory. Both leaders recognized the stalemate. Richard couldn't stay in the Holy Land forever. Saladin couldn't eliminate the Crusader presence. Within a week, negotiations resumed. By September, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. Crusaders kept the coast from Tyre to Jaffa. Muslims kept Jerusalem and the interior. Christian pilgrims could visit holy sites unmolested. But this victory's true impact would echo far beyond that blood-soaked beach. The Battle of Jaffa became legend before the blood dried. Christian chroniclers called it a miracle. Muslim historians, usually quick to minimize defeats, admitted its extraordinary nature. Both sides agreed. Military rules had been shattered on that August morning. The immediate consequences reshaped the Holy Land. The treaty following Jaffa lasted decades, longer than any previous Crusader-Muslim agreement. Richard's audacious victory had proven Crusader resilience, while Saladin's withdrawal showed Muslim pragmatism. Neither side could destroy the other, so they learned to coexist. But the battle's true significance was psychological. Jaffa proved forever that numbers alone don't determine victory. Richard's innovation, immediate amphibious assault, psychological warfare, exploiting enemy overconfidence, would inspire military commanders for centuries. The lesson was clear. Aggression and surprise could overcome any odds if applied with perfect timing. Modern military historians study Jaffa alongside Thermopylae and Rorke's Drift, battles where superior training, morale, and leadership defeated overwhelming numbers. Special forces particularly embraced Jaffa's lessons. British commandos, in World War II, specifically studied Richard's beach assault when planning their own operations. The moment when myth became history. Richard never returned to the Holy Land. He died in 1199, shot by a crossbow while besieging a minor castle in France. Saladin had died just months after Jaffa, in 1193, his treasury so depleted from charity that his burial had to be paid for by friends. The two titans who defined an age never met again after that August day. Yet their encounter at Jaffa transcended military history. It proved that individual courage could still matter in an age of masses, that a king who fought beside common sailors could inspire men to impossible deeds, that sometimes, just sometimes, audacity could triumph over arithmetic. 700 men had done the impossible, proving forever that numbers alone don't win battles. Warriors do. The beach where medieval warfare rules died remains today, now covered by modern Tel Aviv. But on quiet mornings, when Mediterranean waves lap the shore, you can still imagine the splash of Richard's leap into history, the moment when one man's refusal to accept defeat changed everything. The age of Crusader dominance ended with a splash in ankle-deep water. But the legend of that impossible morning reminds us that in war, as in life, the only truly insurmountable odds are those we accept in our minds. Richard the Lionheart never learned that lesson, because he never needed to.